Okay, now we're in Google Earth. And what I want you to do is start taking a look at this and sort of visualize this. I mean, notice how dry this is. You've got a little bit of green over here. This whole region basically, you're just sort of out of luck. This whole area used to be agricultural. And so what you have is several factors come into play. One is, of course, as I mentioned, is the fact that basically the jet stream changes and the water quits falling here. So you end up with as much rainfall and pretty quickly the area dries out. Because if you notice, you have very little in the way of rivers here. This is an area, these mountains aren't high, these hills aren't high enough to actually do anything like that. So here you've got what was left of river systems, but they only were defined back in a period when there was enough rainfall that water would flow down here. And once that's gone, then you're at the mercy of literally whatever rain still happens to show up. So that's one of the really key factors with, especially North Africa. This is also true of West Asia, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, etc., are in the same scenario. But it's even more striking here because unlike Syria and Lebanon, where you still get some rain, but not very much, but you never got a lot. In this area, you went from, basically good rain to zero rain, literally just by virtue of Mother Nature, moving the jet stream about, I believe, about 100 miles north. So now rains ironically in the Mediterranean, which doesn't do these guys a squat. It's no good for them. In fact, it must have been terribly frustrating to be here as a farmer and realize there's no rain coming, but you can see the rain literally offshore to the north of you, going into a sea where it does no one any good except, well, even the fish don't want it. It's fresh water. So in that situation, this is really key. This particular region, all through this stretch of North Africa here, it's called the Maghreb. And it's actually a Arabic term, which has to do with the fact that you have this coastal belt. In fact, you can see the area that's sort of orange-brown here. That was, and in many ways still is, that is the Maghreb. That's the area that had the rain. That's the area that was tremendously agriculturally, good. That suddenly changed when all of a sudden all this situation changed. Now, what happened though is there's still a little bit of rain. You still get rain coming in from offshore. So you get, like the morning, I don't know if it's morning or afternoon rains. It's just like you get here occasionally because you've got all this moisture here, and depending on where the wind blows the moisture inland and drops as rain. So your coastal belt, generally from 50 to 100 miles inland, still actually gets some rain, not enough, for what you wanted to do, but you still get something. But if that's the case, then you got to wonder, well, if they're still getting rain, then what happened? Why does it look like this? And the reason it looks like this is one major factor, and that's the fact that when the agriculture starts to die out, because even though you have some stuff here, you have grasses and stuff growing, you don't have enough water for the same type of agriculture that was growing wheat and whatever else they were growing here during the Roman period. And so what happens is the folks here basically switch over. They switch over from basically being farmers to being what we call pastoralist. So what they do is they then move to grazing animals and run grazing animals and use the results of those animals, whether it be meat for whatever, to make a living, whereas they were using, basically, farming prior to that. So a whole area switches over to basically going to grazing animals and away from farming. Now, in part, that's forced on them by the changes climatically, but it also is something they do just because they think they can make more money off of it. And the end result is an absolute disaster, because the animals they choose are animals that you find in this region. In fact, I think goats originally show up in West Asia, way back before people were. But these are grazing animals that actually can survive very effectively in this environment. But, and the key aspect is here, is that they survive in this environment in their natural state if there's not very many of them, because they're incredibly destructive to plants. Goats get imported here in the 1780s, 1793 by Vancouver. He gives them to Kamehameha as a gift, pointing out that you can use the meat and the fur and stuff like that, and then Kamehameha can make money by selling the goats and the goat products to sailors coming by. And so the monarchy jumps on this, and that's right up with goats. Goats are one of the nightmares of the Hawaiian Islands for exactly the same reasons as here. And the reason is that goats, if there's a few goats, that's okay. Goats make, so if we had 2 or 3 goats on campus, we wouldn't need guys cutting grass. They're great lawnmowers. The problem is if you have 100 goats here, Goats, and to a lesser extent, sheep, unlike other herbivores, like say cattle or horses or stuff like that, have the ability to project their teeth out. So basically they can actually grab plants right at the soil and they'll rip them out of the ground to get the moisture. So in goats, if there's too many goats in an area, when there's done, it looks like this. Or if you want to see the local context you're familiar with this would be Kaiki Nui in East Maui. This would be the area around Kaunakakai, the airport, and Molokai. This would be almost anywhere in the Hawaiian Islands. This would be parts of the North Shore. Is a good example here on Oahu. Anywhere you see absolutely bare space and there's no plants growing there, that's not nature. That's goats, and that's when goats become feral and they breed like rabbits. And so all of a sudden, rather than 10 goats, you got 1,000 goats, and pretty soon you got thousands of goats, and then you've got yourself an environmental disaster. Now, in this part, in the area of the Maghreb area, this is an area that people intentionally bring in the goats for, just like the monarchy did here. You bring in and you use goats to make money, so it's a commercial operation. The problem here, and this is a lot older than the Hawaii situation, is that for the last 1,000 years, people all, of course, want to have more money. They want to have a nicer house. So that means you bring in more goats, you raise more goats. The more goats you raise, the more goats got to eat. And the more what you get into is basically they start eating everything. And then when the rains do occasionally happen, now because the goats have eaten all the vegetation away, what happens is you see here, this area erodes and all your soil ends up out here, which is the same thing you see on Molokai after a heavy rain. If you fly over the island, it's bleeding orange offshore. That's all the topsoil. It's not on the island anymore. It's out in the ocean because the stupid goats went and ate all the vegetation off. The rains hit and washed all the soil offshore. And then what you've got is bare rock and dirt. And if you want to see the classic example, if you ever get a chance to go out there, would be Kaho'olawe. Kaho'olawe is what you get when you have uncontrolled goats in large numbers. You end up with nothing left. It's like sandblasting a place. And that's what happens in this area. Now, the thing that makes this really depressing from an environmental standpoint is the population knows fairly early on this is happening. I mean, people aren't stupid. They literally, if they're raising these goats, they can realize, I can't put my goats here because there's no grass here because I ate it all, so I'm going to move them somewhere else. So pretty soon you just sort of mow down this whole region. But people's self-interest, that they want to have resources, they want to have this, they want to have that. And pretty much ironically, as the goats start to eat everything up, you don't have options anymore. You can't go back to partial agriculture because the goats ate everything and the goats got rid of the soil. So now there's no soil. So you can't grow plants even if you want to. So basically this is a one-way street. And goats are the bane of our existence here in Hawaii. If you do any sort of, agricultural, trying to bring back restored habitats and such. On the ranches, we frequently shoot them on site if we can. They're hard to get, and you really can't control them because there's just a gazillion of the buggers. And they're very, very smart. But on the other hand, they're literally destroying the islands of Hawaii. And the classic sort of poster child for this entire process is here, the North African region of Maghreb, which is basically gone. This used to be 100, 200 miles of coastal zone that was fairly fertile and had a fair number of, agricultural zones. Still, it's famous for dates, for example, and such. The more the goats become the main economic engine for people to make a living here, the more they eat that out. And now you've got Nuncan Maghreb. For much of this region, the Maghreb is only, you can see it right here. This would have all been green here 400 or 500 years ago. Now it's a coastal belt that's maybe a half a mile deep. You literally have destroyed 95 to 99% of your own environment because you decided that making money was more important than what you could see literally in front of your eyes in terms of what you were doing to your environment. So these countries are literally disappearing. And they're literally disappearing in part because of goats, but more importantly, what people are doing with goats and how central goats and goat rearing, goat ranching, I guess you'd call it, has literally destroyed this region. And at this point, it would be hard to visualize how it would ever come back unless first you do is you got to wipe out the goats and quit getting people to raise them. So this is one of the great poster children of environmental history, if you would. You know exactly what animals caused it, you know exactly when it started to happen, and you can see literally the terminal effects of all this right in front of your eyes. Now, the other thing that occurs in this region, especially in North Africa, but well, no, actually in all this region, let's do it very quickly. I mentioned this place last time. So here's the city I mentioned. This is one of the huge Roman cities of the period. Now, this all would have been green. It's all blown out now. Again, same thing as I mentioned, we're part of the Maghreb belt. But the other thing that happens in this region is not only do you get the environmental change when all of a sudden the rains move offshore and there's no longer farms here, so all of a sudden, you don't even have the ability to feed the people in the city, much less ship food out, because this was a major shipping center to ship grains north to Rome and to the rest of the Roman Empire. All of a sudden, you can't do that anymore. What also occurs all throughout this region due to earthquakes and just sort of subsidence is the coastline isn't where it used to be. And Leptis Magna is actually a great case in point. If you see here, you see a pier going from, looks like a petroleum facility here, and you see a pier and going off here. Leptis Magna's port is actually out here. So the harbor where ships used to tie up is actually offshore. And I don't know if I can zoom in here and see them. It's sort of hard to see, but there's actually the old piers are actually out here. And what happened is this whole area both rose and fell. So one of the other things that happened at roughly the same time is not only did the rains go offshore, but literally the coastline dropped, and then some other cases the coastline rose up. Most striking would actually be here. Let's just put it this way so you can. Hang on a second. Google Earth doesn't like it when I rush it. But this whole area, the coastal area of North Africa and West Asia, has gone up and down a tremendous amount. In fact, even players like Greece and Rome has gone up a huge amount in the last couple of thousand years. It's very typical to find large parts of cities are now sunk because the whole coastal shelf just dropped. In other cases, you find that cities are now inland because the combination of silt moving in and coastal lifting has suddenly taken what were coastal ports like Leptis Magna and now put them inland. So this area has a lot of tectonic or activity that's changed. In many cases, it's actually due specifically to volcanic eruptions. Most famous would be the Santorini explosion, Teta. But also just it appears to be just sort of slow subsidence. Part of North Africa is just slowly sinking into the Mediterranean Sea. This obviously isn't going to happen, so we're just going to skip that. So when you're looking at this particular region, it's a very interesting region if you're an environmental specialist, because you can see the consequences of human action that were overlaid on top of natural events. So natural events include the subsidence patterns, but most importantly, the change in climate. And then what happens is people exacerbate that and basically push that to the point where now you've got countries, a lot of your North African countries, they don't have the rivers coming in. They've basically destroyed their entire vegetation belt. And it's hard to visualize that they're actually going to be countries in 20 or 40 years unless they go into major desalination or something like that, because they don't have any way to support their populations. You can survive a couple of days without food, but you can't survive more than 24 hours without water. So this is a part of the world which literally, by virtue of the decisions and choices that people individually and collectively made, have put themselves at risk of existence. Which is one reason why this is one of the reasons where people try to get into Europe. You saw some of these folks in the European situation. This is one reason why this area tends to be very politically unstable, because people can see that their world is literally disappearing in front of them, and no one really knows what to do about it. And to be honest, I'm not sure. So some sort of global effort, I don't know what you would do about it. But by the same token, the people who live there, ironically, now are in a situation where they need things like the goats they've got left, because that's the only money coming in. So, this is also true in places like Lebanon, Syria, to coastal zones of Israel, a little less, they're more industrialized. Egypt, the coastal zones. But it is the same sort of paradoxical situation that people have put themselves pinned themselves into a corner. And at this point, there's no one has any individual or collective, idea of how they're going to get out of it. And that's, people just sort of keep on going on, thinking that somehow, the good tooth fairy is going to show up and it's going to all change.